So it is 12 o'clock and you are all very welcome to this webinar. My name is Jan Sorensen and I'm the Director of the Healthcare Outcome Research Center here at the School of Population Health at the Royal College of Surgeons. It's my pleasure to welcome you all. This is our second event in this planned series of 4 sessions during this year. We have called this seminar series The Future of Cancer in Ireland, Health Economic Perspectives. And this webinar, we have given the title Assessing the Value of New Cancer Treatments and Innovations. We have invited 3 speakers to share their take on the theme. I would like to thank all 3 speakers for their time and willingness to take part in this webinar. In particular, I want to thank our second speaker for agreeing to take part with a very short notice. I will also thank the organizing group that consists of Mark Kavanagh and David Dunn from Janssen Pharmaceuticals, Bridget Cunningham from Novartis, Ronan Glynn from EY Ireland, and my colleagues Brian Lynch, Nora Hammond, and Kathleen Bennett from RCSI. Also, thank you to the 2 companies for their financial support of this webinar series. We are also grateful to Ronan Glynn for taking on the role as moderator for this webinar series. Ronan is the sector lead in EY Ireland and has previously been the Deputy Chief Medical Officer at the Department of Health. I'll now hand over to you, Ronan. The podium is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jan, and delighted to be here again today at the second in this series of webinars. As many of you will recall, our first webinar in March had some really thought-provoking information on the epidemiology of cancer in Ireland. I guess on the one hand, noting the very significant ongoing impact that cancer has on our population, with over 24,000 invasive cancers diagnosed here annually and ongoing high incidence rates compared with our European neighbours, while on the other hand observing the substantial progress that has been made on survivorship from cancer, with Rachel Morrow from the Irish Cancer Society noting that 1 in 22 people in Ireland today are living with a history of invasive cancer. So today we move on to the next instalment in the series, and we're delighted to have 3 fantastic speakers. Dr. Avril Kennan, CEO at the Health Research Charities Board, Dr. Susan Spillane, Deputy Director of Health Technology Assessment at HIQA, and George Crooks, who's the Chief Executive of Scotland's Digital Health and Care Innovation Centre. So just some brief housekeeping. Each speaker will present for approximately 20 minutes and we'll take the 3 speakers in turn. We'll then move on to Q&A, so please pop your questions in the chat and we'll do our very best to get to as many as possible in the time we have. And the plan, of course, is to run the session through until 1:30 p.m. So with that, I might introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Avril Kennan. As I said, she's Chief Executive of the Health Research Charities Board, and the title of her presentation today is What is Value and How do we achieve it? Thanks very much, Avril.
Thank you very much, Ronan, for that. I am just going to share my screen and get started. Okay, I think you can see that there. So this is who Health Research Charities Ireland are. I think that this is probably the best way to describe to you who we are. We're an umbrella organisation for all these charities that have a very strong focus on health research. And no doubt you will recognise some of the logos there, including some high-profile cancer charities who do fantastic work. And our job really is just to support them and represent them and their concerns at a national level. So today we're talking about assessing the value of cancer treatments and innovations, and I'm going to take quite a broad approach to this theme. And I first of all want to ask, what do we mean by value, and also how do we achieve it? So of course, value means different things to different people. It is, of course, clinical effectiveness, really, really important in cancer treatments. Cost effectiveness is also really important. That's just the way of the world now, that we have to take that into consideration. And the bit maybe that gets a little bit left behind sometimes, although less and less, is patient needs and preferences. So patient needs and preferences are really important, obviously, and they don't always align exactly with clinical effectiveness. So looking at it broadly in terms of how do we achieve value? So we need to consider all these types of value. And we need to plan for value from research conception from the very, very start and think about it all the way through. And if we do those things, it gives us an increased likelihood of a positive assessment of value at the end of it all. So to help us think a little bit more about value, this is an international group of funders that have come together called AVEER, Ensuring Value in Research. And these funders came together really in response to some very high profile articles going back a number of years ago about the degree of waste in research, particularly in the Lancet. And they wanted to respond to that, and they've come up with 10 guiding principles to help ensure value from research. I'm not going to go through them all, but if you look at the high level bits in dark blue at the top there, the first one is around relevance and the express need, and getting that right from the start. And in fact, the very first principle below that is that priorities are set involving those who use and are affected by health research. And then the second one is around high quality research that minimizes bias. So that's really around methodologies and setting it in the wider context, thinking about risk in a proportionate way, those kind of things. And then finally, open and transparent research and funding. And that's about sharing all results, very importantly, disseminating knowledge to the end users and ensuring the usage of that knowledge. We have also done some work in this space ourselves, particularly in the area of impact. So impact and value are maybe not exactly the same, but they're hugely overlapping. We ran this, so we run the Irish Health Research Forum, and that brings together multiple different stakeholders. The beauty of these events actually is the diversity of people in the room. So we've got our members in the room, we've got individual patients, we've got all the state agencies that are involved in health research, industry, policymakers, and so on. And we have 2 events a year, and I suppose we tackle the big issues in health research. So we had one on research impact. We called it More Than Publications, Maximising Societal Benefit from Health Research. We had that back in November, and these events are very discussion focused, and out of them we produce recommendations. So if you want to see the full report, I've got a QR code up there. You can flip out your camera quickly and it'll take you to the website with the full report. But these are the recommendations that came out of it. So the first one, again, around planning a path to impact, thinking about it early. Then tailoring communications on research outputs so that they don't just sit on shelves in peer reviewed publications, so they get pushed out into societal benefit, and tailoring those communications for different audiences. So the way we communicate with patients is not the same way as we communicate with policymakers, and so on. The third one is around improving the collection and use of health and social care data. So we know that's an issue in Ireland. Hopefully we're getting closer to improvements in that. But of course, it's very hard to measure if we're achieving value in cancer care if we can't measure things. I'm going to skip over to number 5, and that's around the articulating the evidence that's needed to inform policy. So we want policy to be based on evidence, but actually it's important as well that policymakers tell us what evidence they need to support them in their role. And finally, you see a common theme coming up here, and it's very much a focus for me today, that co-creation of projects with PPI contributors, but all potential end users of the research as well. So going back to that bit of getting the relevance right from the start, and how do we know? So we need to know the unmet medical or health and social care needs in cancer, but how do we know what those needs are? So obviously there's very standard ways to do that. So we can undertake literature searches, attend conferences, learn from healthcare professionals who are patient facing, but the bit that is only sort of coming to the fore in recent years, and that we have a way to go with yet, is public and patient involvement. So by that, I mean not just involving public and the patients in research as participants, not just engaging with them, but actually involving them in research decision making. I do think it's early days, still huge progress being made. I don't know about you, but on most occasions when I attend a doctor, I come away, I guess, a little deflated, feeling like I wish they had more time to understand where my baseline level of knowledge was so that we could take it from there. Or I wish they had more time to understand who I am as a whole person so that we could have the conversation in that context. But of course, they don't have time. The health service doesn't allow that as it stands at present. And that approach, I suppose, that paternalistic or even maternalistic approach has been very present in research as well. And that has been an issue. And it is really, really important that we hear from patients, that we involve patients in all the decision making. So this is something I have seen any number of times up close and personal. So to give you an example, this is the hand of a child who has epidermolysis bullosa, EB. It's a rare, very, very severe skin condition. It is in severe forms, it's one of the most difficult things you can live with, where up to 70% of the body can have open wounds. I used to work in DEBRA Ireland, the organisation that supports people living with EB, and also in DEBRA International, very much with my role was around research. And when I first joined, it was very clear that the top priority in EB, or one of, was pain management, because pain is such a huge issue. And it was only when we really started to ask patients and engage with them on this, what is important to you for research to address, did we learn that actually itch was just important, if not more important, because the itch led to scratching, which led to more wounding, which led to more pain, which also resulted in sleepless nights and lower quality of life. And so we had to really redirect the focus of the research to respond to this. In another example from the EB world, I saw an international, very expensive clinical trial fail at one point, because the investigators didn't ask patients what would work for them in terms of this trial. So it was for a wound healing cream. The trial protocol dictated that it should be applied every day. Trouble with that was the wound dressing in EB is one of the most difficult aspects of the condition. It's very, very painful and very traumatic, and you only do it every 2 days at most. So it was never going to be done every day. And ultimately that trial failed, largely on that basis. And of course, it's the same in cancer, that where there is sometimes that disconnect between what is important to patients, what is possible for patients, and what we think about it from how we think about it from the research perspective. So I hope I've persuaded you a little bit, if you're not already persuaded, that public and patient involvement, PPI, is very, very important. But what feeling, I suppose, does that incite in you? Does the idea of PPI incite in you? Sometimes it's frustration with, how much more am I expected to do? I have so little time. It's not going to make a difference anyway. Totally understandable feelings. I think we need to allow people to express those feelings more actually when they are there. Sometimes it's fear. Will I know how to communicate with patients? Will they understand that there are no guarantees in my research, that it might take a long time? Or will they think that my research idea isn't good? I have all these experiences all the time. I am still learning. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was on a call preparing for a research event with a PPI focused with a couple of new PPI contributors as part of the group. And I launched into, this is what the agenda is going to look like. And they said, well, why are we talking about PPI? Researchers won't listen to us, and even if they did, we don't have the time. And what is this stupid PPI acronym anyway? And it was just a reminder that you have to understand where everybody's coming from, and have the discussions first of all. We came to an agreement about the agenda after that, and I think actually it'll be better for it. But it isn't always easy. But when it works well, there is excitement associated with it, because it really can make research better. And also, if you're that way inclined, it is really nice to be more connected with the people that you're working on behalf of. Just very quickly, some tips on how to approach it. Engaging early is really, really important whether you're engaging with individual PPI contributors, cancer patients, for example, or whether you're engaging with charities, having those conversations so that they can really be shaped together, considering diversity, something we're not good enough at yet. And it's very easy to think, well, this is hard enough as it is. That bit can come later. But actually, I would encourage you to be thinking about that from now. Because if you're thinking about it, you're more likely to be able to bring in the people who need to be in the room, who are ultimately going to be impacted. Make it meaningful. It's not, PPI isn't always necessary. In fact, it's worse to do bad PPI than not to do it at all. And if you are doing it, really consider how it's going to work, what people's roles are going to be, aiming for true partnership. And finally, leading with respect. And honestly, leading with respect covers everything, really, because if you're really considering where people are coming from, if you're considering what they need to take part in it, if you're feeding back to them afterwards, that will ultimately help make it much stronger PPI. So in relation to cancer research, how might PPI contributors be involved? So there's all sorts of different ways that they can be involved. Just a few of them. Priority setting with patients in terms of what they want from research is a really excellent way to approach things. This is a priority setting partnership under the guidance of the James Lind Alliance that is taken place already in terms of living with and beyond cancer. So not cancer treatments necessarily, but in the day-to-day experiences of living with cancer, whether it's fatigue or how do you improve recovery after cancer, how should a diagnosis be delivered, that kind of thing. Patient involvement in patient-reported measures, or also called patient-reported outcome measures, PROMs, in terms of what we are measuring to determine the success of a clinical trial. It's really important to get their input on that because, as I said, it's not always the same as what we can measure clinically and what we are measuring clinically. Input into the research plan, for example, the clinical trial protocol, help with dissemination and communication, particularly with lay audiences, but the cancer charities like the Irish Cancer Society, Breakthrough Cancer Research, they have fantastic skills in being able to communicate with lay audiences and other audiences as well, so that the outcomes of research do ultimately have value. And finally, I think we'll be hearing a little bit about this later on from Susan, but this is a HTA, a health technology assessment undertaken by HIQA recently, and it was great to see that there were some individual patients and also the Irish Cancer Society involved in that. There's lots and lots of support out there for PPI. I think the best place to go is probably the PPI Ignite network. So this is a national network with all the universities, 10 national partners, including ourselves, over 60 local partners, all working together to improve PPI in the country. They have fantastic resources up on their website. In RCSI, you have your own branch of PPI Ignite under the guidance of Dr. Michelle Flood. I know Michelle is always very, very keen for those of you who are researchers to get in touch with her. So there are really, really good supports out there now. Also to mention that the HRCI member charities have a really important role to play in this as well. So when we asked them just a few months ago, what are all the different roles that they carry out? So we know that health research charities fund research, but actually it's much, much broader than that. And if you see right up the top, they're supporting PPI, both in their internal processes, but also supporting researchers in that as well. I always have a slight hesitancy when I say that because they're also very, very under-resourced and they have their own perspectives on it and their own needs on it. And in fact, we're going to be producing a guide, hopefully in the next month, in partnership with the National PPI Network around that relationship between charities and researchers. Finally, just to mention that this is all in the context of a wider cultural shift towards inclusion and impact and value. And just to mention a few of the things that we're seeing more broadly at the moment. So we've got these national strategies. Our national strategy for research and innovation is actually entitled Impact 2030. And it has a very strong focus on engagement with the public. The HRB strategy is excellent. It again, strong focus on impact and particularly on PPI and on patient and public involvement. we've got this the new research and innovation bill. The heads of the bill have just been published, and that's going to play a big role in how research in the country is funded in the future. There seems to be some focus on engagement in there. I think it has been to some extent guided by a fantastic initiative that the government did last year, inviting the public to have their say in what they wanted to see from research, creating our future, and coming through very strongly. And that was that the public wanted to see, they wanted to have more involvement in research. They wanted research to be at the heart of the health service. Department of Health have also got a very important role to play in this, and they ran an event late last year on evidence for policy. Again, that important piece of ensuring that the evidence is pushed all the way through and ultimately having value. There's a general, I suppose we're moving towards rewarding impact as well. And many of the universities, the funders like the HRB, ourselves have impact awards now to reflect that and encourage that. And then we have these wider support structures that are helping all of it, the PPI Ignite network, and also research and development in the HSE are doing fantastic work supporting research dissemination, knowledge translation and impact. All these words, ultimately they all lead towards this theme of today, which is value. So what can you do? I would encourage you to think broadly about what we mean by value, to always ask who else should be in the room. And I think we have a way to go with that yet. So that's PPI and its diversity. And you know, sometimes it's the doctor's receptionist that needs to be in the room, but always asking who is ultimately going to use the outputs of this research. And whatever your role is, be relentless about achieving value from research. So thank you very much. Thanks to the organisers for having me. There's a QR code and a short bit.ly link there where you can sign up to our news and events. We would love to have you on our mailing list. If you're interested in engaging with the charities, if you're interested in these kind of themes that we talk about, we love to have you on that list so we can share events with you and so on, and build this community of people, I suppose, that are in cancer and beyond cancer that are focused on impact and value. Thank you very much.
That's fantastic, Avril. Thank you very much for that. So what we'll do is we'll move on to the next speaker, and then we'll, as I said at the start, we'll come to Q&A at the end. So please get your questions into the chat if you have questions for our speakers. So our next speaker, as I said, is Dr. Susan Spillane, who is the Deputy Director of Health Technology Assessment at HIQA. And Susan today is going to speak to us about HIQA's role in the assessment of cancer interventions. So Susan, thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Ronan. I'll just get my slides up there and check that they are displaying correctly.
Yeah.
Looks okay to me anyway. Great,
Perfect,
thank you. So good afternoon again, everyone. As mentioned, I'm one of the Deputy Directors in the HTA Directorate in HIQA. Just to note today, as mentioned by Jan, I'm joining this webinar relatively late in the day, so apologies if my delivery isn't as polished as the other speakers will be. But I'll do my best anyway. And just to note as well, I'm presenting here on behalf of the overall team in the HTA Directorate in HIQA. I've been involved in mainly all of the projects that I'm presenting today, but I wouldn't have the level of involvement to say the project lead, so I'm not necessarily an expert. But I guess today the purpose is to give more of an overview about some of our work in this area. So for today's webinar, I thought I'd, as I'd mentioned, give a bit of an overview of what we do on the work we do in HIQA in relation to assessing interventions in cancer, including some of our recent work. I won't get into a lot of detail on the specific assessments we've done, but I'll mainly just flag some of the observations we've had while working on these kinds of questions and some of the challenges in assessing value. Just to say, it's really nice actually to be following Avril. I found that presentation very useful for our own work, but a lot of the elements that Avril touched on, they will come up in this presentation as well, I think, and a lot of really relevant points. So firstly, what is HIQA, the Health Information and Quality Authority? So HIQA was established under the Health Act in 2007. It's an independent statutory authority which reports directly to the Minister for Health. And we have a range of functions that we execute in HIQA. So a lot of you might be familiar with the work that HIQA does in regulating, for example, long-term care facilities, monitoring services, or for example, the National Care Experience surveys, where people are asked about their experience of care in, for example, acute hospital care. But the main function I'll be talking about today is our work in health technology assessment. And just to mention here, the HIQA mission, our vision, is safer services and better care for all. To mention as well, it's very core to HTA. It's one of our values that people are put first, and that along with the human rights approach to decision making, the patient or the person affected by the care is at the heart of the decision making. And we do a lot of work on stakeholder engagement strategy as well. So again, a lot of the points in Avril's presentation are really cogent here. So again, looking at the remit of HIQA in relation to health technology assessment, our remit includes evaluating the clinical and the cost effectiveness of health technologies and providing advice arising out of these evaluations to the Minister for Health and the HSE. So again, what we're doing here is providing advice. These aren't binding recommendations. We advise the Minister for Health and the HSE, and then the ultimate decision lies with them. So with regard to HTA specifically, when we talk about health technology assessment, firstly, what do we mean by health technologies? In HIQA, we take, again, quite a broad idea of what health technologies are. Essentially, it could be anything from a tablet that you take to treat a condition, to something like an organizational system that supports the care delivery. So I've listed in blue here just a few examples of health technology assessments we've been involved in recently. So something that you might find a bit more straightforward is the chickenpox vaccine, which we're currently assessing. But another more recent one we've done is the repatriation of pediatric stem cell transplant services. So this fell more under organization of care. And again, I have another example here around providing home ventilation services for spinal cord injury. So our HTAs tend to be quite complex, I guess, in terms of the kind of things we consider. And there's a lot of organizational aspects that we end up considering. So HTA broadly, just to give a bit of background for people not familiar, we think of it as a multidisciplinary process that is essentially a comprehensive look. Again, as Avril mentioned, there's a lot of dimensions of value. So we look at a lot of different domains relating to value. So the social, economic, and ethical issues, in addition to the clinical effectiveness of a health technology. We look at it in a systematic, transparent, unbiased, and robust manner. So the idea here is to inform health policies in a really robust manner and in a way that is patient focused and trying to achieve best value. So the kind of things you look at in a HTA as opposed to a different kind of evaluation. Depending on the HTA agency, different domains can be included, and also sometimes depending on the specific project, different domains will be more relevant than others, but it can be from the starting point, it would be describing what we're currently doing, what the health problem is and the burden of the disease, the burden on the patient and on society of experiencing that condition. We describe the technology that's being proposed, the alternatives. Then we start to look at the safety, the clinical effectiveness of the proposed technology. Then we look at economic aspects, so the cost effectiveness of introducing the technology, but also the cost burden, I guess, to the health system or to society of introducing the technology. In HIQA, we look at ethical aspects associated with it. We look at organizational considerations, so how you might implement the technology, and we look at patient and social aspects in a particular domain additionally. So this might be the wider effects on, say, the family unit or the community or the society of introducing this technology. And we may also look at legal aspects where these are relevant. So then just to introduce how we're operating in HIQA at the moment.
Susan, you've just gone on mute there, I think.
That's very interesting. I have no idea how that happened. Sorry, when did you lose me?
Just at the start of that slide, yeah.
Ah, okay. Apologies for that. I must have clicked something. So just a note, in HIQA, we have several different teams currently. This is different to how we originally started, but just to outline it, we have our HTA general or core team, which is what we would have originally started in our directorate. But in recent times, we have essentially branched out into different functions of HTA. So we provide general HTA, which might be, say, assessing a device, but we also conduct HTAs in relation to immunisation to support the work of the National Immunisation Advisory Committee and to support the work of the National Screening Advisory Committee. We also have several other functions. We support the development of national clinical guidelines through our HRB CISR workstream. We have a public health policy unit, which previously would have been known as the COVID team. So are the work we did to support NEFIT. So now we're pivoting to providing evidence synthesis support to public health policy generally. And then most recently as well, we have a generic justification of ionizing radiation team. So I'll talk a little bit about this a little bit later on. So I previously worked for some time in the National Cancer Institute, and we used to talk a lot about the cancer care continuum. So I've just included a couple of elements of that continuum here to illustrate where we might fit in HIQA to assessing technologies along this continuum. So for primary prevention, this is about stopping a cancer from developing in the first place in the human body. So this could be, for example, HPV vaccination. Secondary prevention could be a technology like screening. So in this case, it might be cervical check to provide early detection of precancerous or cancerous lesions. Then you might have a diagnostic technology. So for example, a CT scan, perhaps a new device that might improve diagnostics. This would fall under HTA, but would also fall under generic justification of ionizing radiation function. And then finally, treatment. So treatment could include radiotherapy, radiosurgery, or other forms of cancer treatment. But I'm just highlighting radiotherapy because, again, this would fall under our generic justification of ionizing radiation function as well. So just to note, we have quite a long history of looking at cancer-related assessments. I've listed a few of these here. So these were all before my time. I joined HIQA in, let's see, it was March 2020. So yeah, these would have all been before my time. But some really influential work in cancer policy in Ireland. So just to give a quick flavour of one of them, this would have been one of the more recent ones, looking at HPV testing for cervical check. To give a quick rundown, this would have been a request from the National Screening Service. The HTA, when completed, was published in May 2017. It involved the major components would have been 2 systematic reviews of the clinical effectiveness of HPV testing. So the HTA compares HPV testing with what we were previously doing, which was cytology testing, and then looked at the triage options. So if you do HPV testing, what comes next? Is it cytology or otherwise? And what would be the implications of these? And then there was economic evaluation of different screening strategies as well. So focusing on the vaccinated versus the non-vaccinated populations. And then there would have been, the wider considerations like the organizational and implementation issues, the social issues around changing the testing issues and the ethical aspects of it. And these are just small excerpts from our key findings. Reports like this, they tend to run to 300 to 400 pages. But we would produce a couple of pages of key findings and advice for the Minister for Health or the HSE, which would boil it down to the main points. In this case, essentially, it found that adopting a HPV testing strategy at 5-year intervals from 25 to 60, we consider that to be cost effective with an incremental cost effectiveness ratio of about €30,000 per quality adjusted life year. In Ireland, we typically use thresholds of either €20,000 per quality gained or €45,000 per quality gained. So this would fall within that range, where something above that €45,000 per quality range, we start to think of it as not necessarily cost effective. And then the second point here was about extending screening for the age group from 60 to 65 years. And while this was considered to be not cost effective, the ethical aspects around this did come in. For example, historic rates of underscreening. and how it may be ethically appropriate to screen up to 65, but that this would warrant a targeted campaign to encourage uptake. So it's just to highlight, I guess, some of the kind of wider issues we think about, and just to note that this is what has been implemented in cervical check. So just the next example I'm going to go through is something we've been doing more recently. So I mentioned that we have a HTA function that works to inform the work of the National Screening Advisory Committee. So this is a recent committee that was established in, I think, 2019, and our team has been supporting since early 2021 on various different projects. So the National Screening Advisory Committee, they, since 2021, have run an annual call for submissions. So anyone can submit to this, member of the public, clinician. It's open to anyone, and it could be for a new topic to screen for or for a modification to an existing program. So the NSAC had a proposal submitted to them to extend the age of eligibility for each of breast check and for bowel check, or for bowel screen. And for breast check as well, there was also a proposal around whether we should be looking at assessing breast density as part of our breast check screening in younger cohorts. So the National Screening Advisory Committee considered these proposals and requested that HIQA start to look at these and consider what might be involved. So the approach we've taken thus far was largely a scoping approach. So in the first instance, given that these are very large projects, we've been looking to gather information to help inform the committee about what they might, how they might consider the scope of these projects, or how we might sequence the projects in our work stream. So the approach we took initially was to gather, using a scoping methodology, just high-level information on the key topics that would be likely to inform a decision down the line. So it's just to highlight how we might do a piece of work that's a bit shorter in timescale, where we need to make some kind of decision quicker. So using a scoping methodology, we're essentially looking for secondary research. So we're not going through every single study ever published. We're trying to go straight to existing HTAs internationally, or existing systematic reviews where that evidence has already been synthesized, but it does represent a subset of the information. So I won't go into the work in detail, mainly because it hasn't been published yet, and these topics are still under consideration by the Screening Advisory Committee. But we did provide scoping reports to the committee in September, which they considered at their recent meetings. And just from a methodological point of view for ourselves, one very obvious challenge we encounter is that the questions that were submitted to us related to age extension in particular subgroups, but frequently the evidence that we find doesn't line up to what we really need to answer. So the evidence we found internationally for each of breast check and bowel screen related to broader age groups. And again, for bowel screen, other countries will screen using different methods. So for example, in the US, there's a heavy reliance on colonoscopy, whereas our first line screening tier is the FIT test. So it's just one of those methodological challenges where a lot of those studies may not be relevant to or transferable to our situation in Ireland. Just to note, looking at these kinds of projects, we did do the scoping work to, I guess, provide a preliminary review to the committee on relevant aspects, but to inform a full decision on age extension or changing these programs, it generally would require a full HTA. So this would be the next step for us. And a big challenge here is the time required, particularly where a de novo economic evaluation is required, and where there's decisions to be made about, to what extent we can model this using what data is available. So these are the things we work on in coming up with our plan for a health technology assessment, and whether or not we might need to go out to public consultation when that HTA is concluded to see if there's any information that we need to that we might have missed and that the public might be able to contribute. So the scoping work was completed in September. It's been discussed at the committee meetings since then. Our next steps in HIQA are, well, there's been a decision by the committee that both of these HTAs are warranted and relevant, but to progress the bowel screen HTA ahead of the breast check. This largely relates to capacity issues currently and the efficiency around doing this HTA first. So we're looking at this, but we do have a wider work program around non-cancer HTA as well for the committee. So that includes looking at newborn screening, infant screening, and other adult non-cancer topics. So this is work we're doing ourselves about how to maximize the efficiency of when we get these projects completed. And part of this involves trying to determine the capacity to leverage the existing work that's been done. So what existing systematic reviews have been conducted? How can we incorporate that data? Is what work has been done of a sufficient quality to inform the decision making we want to do in Ireland? And then again, looking at how we might go about doing these economic evaluations or the resource modelling and whether we can gather the appropriate data. So that's just to outline some of the kind of preliminary work we might do in HTA in assessing value of cancer screening. So my second example here was alluded to by Avril earlier. So this is about gene expression profiling in early stage breast cancer. So it's a relatively complex topic to summarize quickly, but just overall, this was a request that came into us from the HSE National Cancer Control Programme. The aim here was to provide advice to the HSE on alternatives to a test called Oncotype DX. And these are tests that are suggested for use in informing decision making in relation to the management of early stage invasive breast cancer. So historically, if a woman had early stage breast cancer, it wasn't necessarily clear cut that this woman would need chemotherapy. There would be, a shared decision-making process between that person and their clinician, their oncologist, about whether they should go ahead with chemotherapy, given the disadvantages associated with it. And historically, this would be informed by, clinical factors, things like the age of the patient, but tumor aspects like tumor grade and different receptors that might be present on this tumor surface. But more recently, we have new technologies available like Oncotype DX, which essentially profile the different genes in an individual's tumor and how active they are. The idea is that this gives you a sense of how likely that tumor is to recur, and that would inform whether or not the patient would be likely to benefit from chemotherapy. The advantages are, of course, if the patient can avoid chemotherapy safely, there's huge advantages to the patient themselves, to their family. But there's also advantages to the health system in that chemotherapy is very costly. It involves obviously resources in hospital, bed days and so on. So if everybody would win, basically, the more chemotherapy that can be safely avoided. So for this project, we adopted a rapid HTA approach. This was partly due to the need to make decision relatively quickly on the different approaches here, but also because we looked at the information that was available through a little bit of scoping to see what could be done here. So the background here is that in 2011, the HSE reimbursed this Oncotype DX gene expression profile test in a specific patient population. This was people with these particular tumor markers and who had a lack of lymph node involvement in their breast cancer. And this followed a recommendation by the HSE National Cancer Control Programme Technology Review Committee. And in 2019, this reimbursement was extended to patients with lymph node positive breast cancer, and this had followed emerging evidence. In 2022, I guess, when we started looking at this HTA, there were 3 other tests available but not reimbursed in Ireland. Looking at them, we weren't clear that we would have the available evidence to be able to conduct a robust health economic evaluation. So for this reason, and for several other reasons, we went with this rapid HTA approach where we would restrict the HTA to specific domains, particularly looking at the clinical effectiveness of the tests and the description of the technology, some information about tests, about the test characteristics and what's being used internationally, as these were the most relevant to the decision that was going to be made at that time, which was namely, is there something that we're missing by using Oncotype DX? Would it be more appropriate to use one of these alternative tests, or how do they compare? So as mentioned, we took the approach of focusing on the description of technology, looking at the epidemiology, the extent of the population that would be eligible for these tests, and the clinical effectiveness. And within that, we looked at 3 different outcome sets. I won't go into this in too much detail as it's quite technical, but essentially we were largely focusing on predictive ability. And what we mean by that is the ability, if you use the test, essentially, how well does it predict that a patient is likely, if they're classed into a low risk group, how likely is it that their cancer is unlikely to recur, so that the test is accurately predicting that it is accurately predicting their lack of benefit of chemotherapy. Or conversely, can the test predict accurately that a patient is likely to benefit from chemotherapy?
2 minutes, Susan.
Oh yeah, I'll run on a little bit here. So in the clinical effectiveness, what we found essentially, and I'm just highlighting this example to illustrate some of the challenges we identified with these tests. Some of the things we found when trying to assess value are generally a lack of head-to-head comparative evidence across the tests, a lack of direct evidence that using the tests improves health outcomes, a lack of long-term effectiveness data, and a lack of comparison to what we were doing previously. Essentially, that's what it boiled down to. So this was quite challenging for us, and it's quite challenging in assessing value generally in this space. So in producing our advice, what we landed on was that for particular patient populations, particularly in lymph node positive patients in certain groups, the evidence did most strongly support the continued use of the existing test, Oncotype DX. However, we noted a lot of challenges in this, and one of the main issues we were highlighting was, as mentioned, these issues around the clinical effectiveness data, like the lack of adequate follow-up or head-to-head evidence, the fact that we had a limited understanding of what would have been the baseline approach to decision-making. And our advice to the HSE included advising on collecting data on the use of these tests in Ireland, linking this to patient outcomes and collecting this as a database so that we could try and assess the clinical impact in the long term, and also developing more discrete guidance on how to identify which patient groups these tests should be used in. So it's just, these wider issues around data collection. So just for the final example, I'm just going to try and fly through this quite briefly, but we have a new function in HIQA now, which involves generic justification of medical exposures to ionizing radiation. So I'm sure most people here would be aware that radiation is useful in cancer diagnostic and treatment, but can also be very dangerous. There are a lot of different medical exposures to ionizing radiation, like mammography or radiotherapy or radiosurgery. So HIQA has recently been made the competent authority for patient exposures to ionizing radiation, and this is under national legislation which arose from an EU directive. So HIQA is responsible for justifying the use of ionizing radiation in patients in Ireland, and particularly the Health Technology Assessment Directorate. So what we mean by justification is that we're essentially weighing up the risks and benefits of exposure to ionizing radiation. And the kind of justification we're required to do is level 2, which is at a population level. So if we were going to if we'd never had X-rays before, for example, and X-rays were a new technology, we'd be looking at whether the use of them was justified at a population level in Ireland. So there's a few projects underway in this area. I'm just going to mention one here. This is piflufolastat injection. This is an assessment that's currently being begun by our team. And for example, it's an injectable that you can use to improve imaging of metastatic prostate cancer. Our approach to justifying this or any other technology is outlined in a comprehensive methods document that we have published on the HIQA website. But in brief, if a technology is to be introduced, there has to be an application made to HIQA. An evidence synthesis is carried out by HIQA depending on the risk level we think is associated with the technology. We'll take different approaches, but we'll always conduct some form of evidence synthesis. This will be submitted to an expert advisory group who will review that evidence and make a recommendation. And finally, there's a decision made by HIQA as to whether this the use of this technology can be justified. the varying levels of review, they depend on international experience with the agent, also on the level of risk associated with the dose, or the level of risk associated with the technology, or the level of increased dose of radiation that would be involved in the technology, and we'll adapt our approach depending on this. And as mentioned by earlier, stakeholder involvement is hugely important in this, and we have a very large expert advisory group known as the MIR AAG. So these are just examples of some of the stakeholders involved in this, and they would be involved in that recommendation on the benefits and harms. So just very finally, just a few observations across all of this is, I haven't gone into it in depth, but Avril gave us a really important outline of stakeholder involvement. In HIQA, stakeholder involvement comes into every piece of work we do that advises the Minister of Health and the HSE. We always establish a robust expert advisory group, which has members across all disciplines relevant to the technology. And we take a lot of care in establishing that. And it's invaluable to the quality of our HTA that we have that expert group informing it. But just some other observations around our HTA work in cancer. Something we think about a lot in HIQA is, what is really needed to inform the decision, and where is the value, what is the question we need to answer. So for example, for something like cervical cancer screening, we really need to do a very comprehensive evaluation across all the domains there. For something like the gene expression profiling tests, we're limited largely by the quality of the evidence. We also need to produce a report relatively quickly to inform decision making. And we were focusing largely on clinical effectiveness there rather than the cost aspects. For the cancer screening, there we're looking at informing prioritization as opposed to a full HTA approach in the first instance. And in generic justification, our focus on the value is mainly within the domains of safety and the additional benefit as opposed to the cost. And just again, across these examples, it's really important for us to tailor the product to answer the question really efficiently, given in order to make a difference, decisions have to be made, albeit, with robust evidence behind them, but we need to make efficiencies where we can. And just finally, I guess I haven't really talked much about economic evaluation, which would usually be our bread and butter in HTA. But as mentioned, there's two different components to this. Our capacity to perform economic evaluation is often limited by the quality of the evidence. So again, like for the tumor profiling HTA, we didn't feel the cost utility analysis would even really be possible with the data we have, and we weren't sure how meaningful it would be. So again, the focus was very much on the clinical effectiveness of the different alternatives. And for cancer screening, for economic evaluation, a big concern for us is what can we use that's there already to improve our efficiency. But other aspects I didn't go into detail here are, the value is in the clinical effectiveness and the cost effectiveness, but it's also in the feasibility of whether these technologies can be implemented and what needs to be put in place. And of course, what are the ethical, the social, and the legal issues around this technology, and what does it mean for our society? And finally, in addition to our stakeholder involvement throughout the HTA, we do also go out to public consultation on a lot of our HTAs that would affect the population. So something like cancer screening, that would go out to a public consultation. So these are components that are, I guess, very relevant in assessing value. So I've gone a bit over time there, so I'll finish, but thank you very much.
Fantastic, Susan. Many thanks for that really comprehensive overview of what's a fantastic service, I think. We'll move on now, I think, to Professor George Crooks, who's our third speaker today. He's the Chief Executive of Scotland's Digital Health and Care Innovation Centre. And George, delighted that you're going to join us today and tell us a little bit more about Aim for All, which is a novel initiative in Scotland to improve access to innovative medicines. So looking forward to hearing all about it. Thanks, George.
Great, thank you very much indeed. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully you can see my slides, Ronan.
Yeah, perfect.
Good, excellent. Being the Chief Executive of Scotland's National Innovation Centre for Digital Health and Care always gives me a bit of a level of anxiety when I click that button and to see whether the digital technology will actually work or not. And at least this time it isn't kind of sabotaging the presentation. So, what am I going to talk about? Well, I guess what I'd like to do is to really put a bit of injection into reality today, and also to try to tie together a little bit of what the two previous speakers said. As we sit here today at our computers, we must consider the current environment that all of us are trying to deliver high quality, safe and effective healthcare in. I think it would be fair to say the environment is significantly different to that we have had in the past. And it's not all simply down to the wonderful coronavirus, although the post-COVID recovery is exercising all our minds within our systems. But let me just do a quick reminder that the challenges we're facing in Scotland, the UK and in Ireland and across Europe are replicated all around the world, not just in the global north, but also in the global south and in low and middle income countries. Demand and capacity challenges are significant. The percentage of a nation's gross domestic product by being consumed through delivery of healthcare is increasing exponentially. And we now recognise that that isn't sustainable, certainly not sustainable in the medium and long term, and I would probably concede it's not actually sustainable in the short term either. And then when you add to that the demographic challenges of an ageing population, the inexorable rise of long-term conditions and non-specific illnesses like frailty, and then of course the burden of disease, which we heard about in the first seminar and earlier on today referred to again, the number of people developing and living with cancers are putting a significant strain on our population, let alone on our health and care delivery system. And then if all that wasn't bad enough, we've got issues of workforce availability and workforce planning. And then finally, the challenges of climate change. So before we all burst into tears and decide that it's hardly worth carrying on, I think we need to ask this question. So what is our future? And my view is that our future actually is quite good. And particularly when we focus on oncology and on cancer, though we've got huge issues around about the increasing numbers of cancers we're having to deal with, but we're beginning to turn our focus, and we heard earlier, onto issues about prevention and early detection. And clearly we know the earlier we can detect and the earlier we can start treatment, the better chance we have of delivering a good outcome. And then, of course, we've had significant advances in treatments, and not just in radiotherapy, but I'd like to feature my presentation a little bit more on the medicines and the advanced therapeutics that are coming, a bit like a tsunami towards our healthcare system. And they are causing both opportunity and hope, but they're also causing huge, amazing heartaches and problems, both to our health technology assessment colleagues, as we heard a little bit about earlier, but certainly to our directors of finance and others, because we're increasingly, as a healthcare system, being faced with potentially life-transforming drugs, cell and gene therapies, CAR T therapies and others being examples. Potentially life-transforming, incredibly high cost, with an emerging evidence base. So the issues about pricing, risk management, and affordability have never been higher up the psyche, both of our clinical community, but also senior managers, directors of finance and others. And then on the other side of the equation, you've got the population, certainly who are expecting to have access to these medicines, and particularly if it is your wife, your son, your daughter, a member of your family. And then so there's also a political pressure that sits alongside all of that, that has to be taken into account. So it's a really interesting, but very difficult and challenging and conflicting environment that we're trying to navigate here. And I'd like to give you a little bit of insight into my world in Scotland. And I'm being asked to lead a piece of work looking at advanced therapeutics and how we can look at this from a whole system point of view, and I want to give you a bit of insight into why we're doing this. Now in Scotland, and it's exactly the same in Ireland, we've heard it earlier, all our aspiration is we put the patient, or in fact the citizen, at the centre of all we do. And that's the approach that we're taking in Scotland when we're looking at the area of advanced therapeutics. And for us, it's really about finding out what the patient wants, because when we talk about value and value-based pricing or value-based contracting, or what is the value of medicines, we often look at value through our own lens. We've heard a little bit from a health technology assessment point of view, how you try to assess value. We also heard from the third sector, from the charity sector, a slightly different approach to value. And therefore, what is it that's important to a patient? And also, what is most important, an important judge of value for a clinician might actually be different to that for a patient. It may actually be different from a person in finance and central government, where the price paid for a medicine is not so much on longevity, it's on about return to economic productivity of someone being able to go back into the workplace and contribute to society, as opposed to the number of years on the planet they have being completely dependent on health and care systems for their day-to-day living. So value is something that we really need to bottom out as we look at this whole area. And certainly in Scotland, and I'd be very surprised if it's any different in Ireland, we are still wrestling with these challenges. So the other part of the environment I need to put out there, and this is the Scottish perspective, and it will be slightly different in Ireland, but there are some similarities. When you look at advanced medicines and the whole area of innovation in healthcare, we looked at the availability of new medicines for our citizens. And we found that 54% of new medicines approved by the European Medicines Agency were made available between 2017 and 2020 in Scotland. And our success rate, if you can use the word success here, is much lower than other countries in Europe, and it's actually slightly lower than in Ireland. And as a result, Scotland only ranked 10th for medicines receiving market authorisation between 2017 and 2020. And clearly in the field that we're talking about today, in oncology, this has potentially profound consequences for patient outcomes. And the reason for that is a lot of what I said earlier, the issues not simply to do with effectiveness, but to do with risk management and pricing decisions. Then layer on top of that the more generic issue about economic development and growth, which is probably more important for the well-being of our countries than investment in healthcare delivery is. So in Scotland, we have a life sciences strategy. We recognise that life sciences is one of the major economic drivers in Scotland. I know it is in Ireland as well. And Scotland has recognised it needs to become more effective as a place to develop innovations and to commercialise those innovations into product. And for us to be successful, we really need to be much more impactful in how we link our research community with adoption and scaling of these innovations. So in the field of oncology, we're looking to increase the number of clinical trials. That's key for us. And we believe it won't only bring economic benefits to Scotland, but again, it will improve health outcomes because we will get some of these potentially life-transforming medicines into the hands, arms, mouths of our patients earlier than would be otherwise. So there's a win-win here if we can get our act together. So what that put in my head is that the health agenda is inexorably linked to the wealth agenda. And maybe we need to recognise that as a positive thing as opposed to a negative thing, where we tend to, certainly within healthcare, take the moral high ground and move that away from the nasty big pharma industry who are trying to do nasty things to us. So for us, again, in oncology in particular, what it came down to was, if more clinical trials become available for us, the greater we can hope for patient survival and quality of life. We will learn more about how to develop and administer new life-saving treatments. Patients receiving treatment in many cases can return to work and support the economy, which I mentioned earlier. And then, of course, research and upskilling in life sciences in Scotland can encourage big pharma, who are the biggest investors in innovation anywhere in the world, to invest in our countries and create jobs, the win-win in here. So I was asked on behalf of Scottish Government to lead a project to try to redefine this landscape and move us forward. And we decided that we would use CAR-T therapy as a case study. And this was my fault, because I thought, let's take CAR-T, because very small number of patients in Scotland benefit from it, about 65 to 70 per year. So this wasn't going to be too difficult to do, thought I. Far from it, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second. But the reason we chose it, there are potential for excellent clinical outcomes. A number of these medicines we knew were in phase 4 trials. They were coming our way, and they were going to have to be subject to tough pricing and decision making about availability. They're all very expensive. But if we got this right, it would support that life sciences agenda. But why me? Why the director of our National Innovation Centre for Digital Health and Care asked to do this? Well, I was a medical director for the NHS in Scotland for 15 years, so maybe it was because I knew a bit about the system, but it wasn't that at all. It was actually because for the formal NHS to do it in Scotland, or for the government seeming to be doing it, there were too many political high risks. So using the national innovation infrastructure to do it, who are one step removed from government, it de-risked some of those political risks and allowed us to engage in honest and open discussions with academic researchers, with the pharmaceutical industry, with healthcare specialists, the consultant clinicians, and others, in a way where we could have enabling conversations, which weren't behind closed doors that others would then say were in smoke-filled rooms. So that was the injection of reality we came to. And then we realized that we needed to stop looking at the field of oncology, and particularly all these advanced therapeutic medicines, as products. It's not a tablet or a vial. We're actually talking about services. And it's a clinical service, because for CAR-T to administer the medicine, that's the simple bit. It's having availability of an intensive care bed, should things go wrong, having the apheresis service from your blood transfusion service geared up to work. There are all sorts of system issues that have to be in place for this medicine to be administered, and for the follow-up to be in place and guaranteed. So we need to change our mindset. We need to stop thinking about products, start thinking about services. And then here we go again, and it goes back to what was mentioned by the first presenter today. It's never about the drug, it's all about data. Because when we looked at our data landscape in Scotland, very similar to Ireland, and I'll be honest with you, our health data landscape for a population of 5.4 million is large, unnecessarily complex. It's fragmented. Our data, we are incredibly data rich, but in fact, the quality of that data is not that good. And is that data accessible, particularly to machine learning and AI algorithms? The answer to that is no, it's not. And then when we looked at CAR-T, where we have one single national clinical service provided out of the Beatson Oncology Centre in Glasgow for the whole of Scotland, I discovered that we did not have an agreed single standardised data set for the management of these patients. And therefore, the first thing we needed to do is we needed to look at standardising our data set, and then also how we made the collection of that data much easier for our clinical community. And the old mantra of collect the data once and use it multiple times came into its own. So what we did is we went out and we spoke to all the actors, and we have now agreed in CAR-T, and CAR-T is only the vanguard. We're now going to roll this across all other modalities across oncology, where we have got an agreed standardized data set being used by our academic researchers in that field, by our clinicians who are in the healthcare system and diagnosing and treating these patients. That's agreed. We got that data set signed off by our HTA agency here in Scotland. We also then shared that data set with the pharmaceutical industry and basically said, is there anything in this data set that's missing from your point of view? And believe it or not, they said, yes, there are. There are a couple of things. And the one that stood out for me, there was only two, but the one that stood out for me is they wanted prolonged outcome data of additional primary cancers. That didn't come from our clinical community, it came from the industry itself. And then we went to those involved in pricing and procurement and contract monitoring, and we said, out of this clinical data set, what is the subset, the base subset that you would want for monitoring value-based contracts? And we're just finishing off that stage of the process. So we will have a standardized data set that goes from trial into live, into pricing, into post-marketing surveillance. And we will start to build these data sets up. But we're not going to do them as islands, an island of excellence for CAR-T, like we have done in the past with our cancer registries, where we have individual islands of clinical excellence. We are designing our supportive base ICT infrastructure to actually deliver that. So the objectives of this project we're taking forward in Scotland are to standardise the CAR-T data collated across the country. We're just finishing that off. Building a digital service that can be used to maintain the clinical data routinely corrected using our base ICT infrastructure. Make sure that that is 80 to 90% generic, so as it can work in other disease groups and support other medicines and other classes of medicines. And at the end of the day, the whole thing is to make sure that we can quality assure our systems and processes to serve the needs of the patient, their family, and the community in which they live. And we have to also make sure we do that in the most cost-effective way possible. So for us, when we talk about an enabling system, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a whole system approach here. So it's a new paradigm for us, which seeks to resolve the affordability question with the reimbursement challenges and make sure that there are no unintended consequences. And therefore, we're using user-centered design at all stages of the process. The patients are at the center of this and are dictating a lot of what we're doing, but as are those tasked with administering the service, whether they're clinicians, managers, those driving the vans transporting products hither and thither across the country, to make sure we get this as right. Because unless we understand who our customers are, it's not just the clinician or the oncology service or the patient. Everybody as part of that chain has to be regarded as a customer, and they have to be seen to get value out of it. because if they perceive they're getting value out of it, they will put more time and effort and attention in. That drives up the quality of the data, and night then follows day. So I'm going to stop there. I've talked enough. That is just a taster of what we're doing here in Scotland. I hope you found it interesting, and I look forward to having some discussion. Thank you very much for your time.
It's fantastic, George, and I might ask Avril and Susan to put their cameras on as well, if that's okay. We have 15 minutes for questions. So first of all, sincere thanks to the three of you for three fantastic presentations. And I think the theme running through them all was this central concept of ensuring that it's not our own personal or our own professional lens that we're using to assess value, and that we need to ensure that there's different phrases used, but user-centered design, putting the patient, putting the public at the center of research and decision making. So fantastic. I might start just in the order of the speakers that we had, and Avril, I might come to you in the first instance. You mentioned that there's a wider cultural shift happening around the topics that you were talking about, and within that, the importance of inclusion and diversity in PPI. And can I ask, it may seem like the answer may seem obvious, but I don't think there's any harm in having it reiterated. Why is inclusion and diversity, or why are those topics so important when we talk about PPI?
Yeah, thanks a million, Ronan. First of all, can I just say I loved the connection actually between the talks. I'm always worried mine's going to be out in the limb that I've totally misinterpreted the brief, but actually they really, there was a synergy between them, which was lovely. Inclusion and diversity, it's something we need to keep talking about actually, and it's really important from the perspective of research participants, so subjects in research, and also the PPI piece. So we know that we haven't done well in terms of research participants. There's a lot of talk at the moment about women's health and how we need to invest more in that because it has got left behind. And we also know that when you think about cancer drugs, everybody is genetically different and is going to respond differently to those drugs. The emphasis in genetics and genomics research has been, as they say, on people of European descent, far too much. So what are we missing with everybody else? And then it's also about how people experience the world. So a migrant in Ireland is not going to experience the health service in the same way as a person who was born here. And a transgender person is going to experience it differently. And an Irish traveller is going to experience it differently as well. So we need to, and we don't know how they experience the world unless we ask them and involve them.
Fantastic. And then I'll come to you, Susan. Just along a separate but related theme is you took us kind of on a tour of what HIQA does in terms of HTA and assessment, and it's so comprehensive. And I know the function has grown so much over the past decade. But one of the pieces you mentioned throughout was the importance of stakeholder consultation. You mentioned the expert advisory group around ionizing radiation, and then at the end you mentioned about public consultation. And maybe can you just tell us a little bit more about the kind of the approach that HIQA takes to, I guess, in particular, the expert advisory group piece, and do you have a different expert advisory group for every new project, and how do you identify the key stakeholders, and then around that public consultation piece, and when you go out and when you don't?
Yeah, that's perfect. It's a hugely important piece of our work in any project where we're giving advice, because we, as researchers, we're collecting the evidence, and we're skilled in that, we have experience, but there's also the possibility that we're missing pieces, or we're not interpreting it with the fullness of the clinician or the patient or the societal experience. So at the start of every project, we aim to convene an expert advisory group that's broad. So, as I mentioned on the slide, we'll have people with clinical experience, nursing, across any specialty relevant to that technology. And then we'll look at people involved in implementing the technology. But obviously then, patient representative groups, patients themselves, the decision makers involved in the end result. So we get that group together. We'll informally be in touch with them to ask for, if they have materials they can share, or to ask their opinion on particular pieces if we're not sure. Then at particular phases in the project, we'll get everyone together for an expert advisory group meeting, and we'll present our findings, and we'll ask if there are pieces we've missed. And at that point, we can actually get some really relevant insights. And then at the end of the project, again, we'll have a final meeting, and we'll have opportunities for that group to feed back on the advice. The approach we take to gathering the different groups is, well, now we have a very big unit in HTA, so we have a lot of people with diversity of professional background. So it means that people actually have a lot of connections to relevant stakeholders, and we have a lot of experience with different stakeholder groups. But we'll also ask, the clinicians or the people working with patients about who they think we should be talking to. And then at our first meeting, we'll ask, is there anyone we've missed? So often people will say, well, I really think we could use psychology input into this one, for example. And it's been hugely beneficial. So I mentioned a project we had on, this isn't cancer per se, but repatriation of stem cell transplant services. So that was for non-cancer conditions in pediatrics. And Avril just mentioned, the experience of the Irish traveller community. And the conditions we're looking at are, they're overrepresented in the traveller community. So it was really important that we got their perspective. And in talking to some of the patients or getting the patient advocacy groups' experiences, we were hearing about their unique experience in having to travel abroad, what that meant for them, or what it meant for migrant groups who had to travel abroad for treatment, and the unique stresses that brought to them, in addition to bringing a sick child for a stem cell transplant. And that was hugely informative. So it's just one example of the kind of different lenses we get that you won't necessarily get from the published literature.
Sure, fantastic. George, you spoke about user-centered design, and at the start of your presentation, or halfway through your presentation, you spoke about the importance of enabling conversations. I think your presentation made what you've done sound really simple and straightforward, and I'm certain it wasn't. But one of the pieces that I think is particularly interesting is that you've managed to agree standardized data sets for new technologies, and subsequently they've been signed off by Scottish HTA agency. What was the process around the discussion of that data set, the agreement around it? Was it a prolonged process? Was it a difficult process?
It was a prolonged process because it's as you've had a bit of an insight from Susan and from Avril, that there are a large number of actors in this ecosystem. So it's not just 2 or 3. I mean, it's an enormous number that you have to go out and talk to. But everybody we spoke to said the system at the moment is not good. Nobody thought the status quo was acceptable. So that was a good starting point. And everyone gave of their time. And the interesting thing was, it actually ended up not being difficult. We had agreement breaking out everywhere. Now, you know that, I mean, we can say this, I'm sure some of the participants today are senior clinicians. A senior clinician's behaviour sometimes, for the most intelligent people in society, leaves a lot to be desired. I can say that because I'm sitting at a desk here in Scotland. I'm separated by a body of water and several hours journey time. So I can say that. I can say that as a senior clinician myself. In this case, everybody was more than happy to give of their time and to enter into the discussion. So actually, it wasn't that difficult to do. It was just actually deciding we needed to do it. And then when we said that we were going to share it with the pharmaceutical industry, there was a few raised eyebrows in certain quarters saying, why are you doing that? I said, well, actually, this is really important. And then I've got to watch Susan's face when I say this. Our HTA colleagues, and you'll know some of them, Susan, I'm sure, and they're delightful people, all of them, that when we said that we're going to bring in the pricing and contract negotiation people, there were a few raised eyebrows at that, because HTA and pricing, it's different. The different organizations, it's a dirty world out there when you get money involved from the pure science of it all. But it was really important. And what the pricing people said is, actually, we don't need these 25, 30, 40 data points. We actually need only 4 or 5. And then we said to them, actually, let's talk about the value proposition, because of the 4 and 5 things that you think are important from a system point of view, what's the patient think is value in this? So we're just finishing that negotiation of how we do the pricing. And then the last bit, Ronan, and then I'll shut up because I get on my high horse about this, because I found it really fascinating, is that we are then saying, going back to our HTA colleagues, and we're saying that in medicines, if you could continue on the journey with us through into post-marketing and beyond, as opposed to what a lot of the focus of attention is up until licensing, and it's signed off by the Scottish Medicines Consortium in Scotland to be administered safely in Scotland. And then we kind of lose attention on it, and it moves to a different group of people who then monitor the cancer outcomes. We're saying we want the same actors to stay on the whole journey, so we get continuity of input and continuity of view, and people were up for that too. So we're just about to run a living lab and do a real drug going through this process from start to end. Have we cracked it? No, we haven't. But in Scotland, we have decided we cannot continue to do it the way we're doing it at the moment. It's not serving anybody well. And everyone is well-intentioned, but no one is happy.
So essentially, if I understand you correctly, George, what you're saying there is assessment of value is not a point in time thing. No. It's going to be an ongoing process that's going to run through on past reimbursement and out into the real world on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can go back to what Avril said, was understanding the lived experience of our citizens and our patients are fundamental in this. So one thing when we're looking at our data set is we are now having to blend some citizen-generated data with formal health and care data to understand that lived experience, because we will have some citizen-generated markers as markers of quality, as well as the blood test results, the scan results, etc. We're stopping treating lab results and we're starting to treat the citizen.
And just related to that, then I suppose, Avril, I guess if we looked at the list of things that Susan had on the slide about, you know, what's assessed, and there's clinical effectiveness, cost effectiveness, and, you know, traditionally we look at how many extra years of life will this drug give or will this technology bring. But as you said, that's not necessarily what's of most value to individual patients or patient groups. And I just wonder if you have any advice or thoughts on how over time we might better integrate those traditional measures of, or those historic measures of value from a clinical perspective, I guess, with what's actually important when you look at it through a different lens.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to pretend this is easy, and I think Susan and George got across so eloquently just how complex it is. But if you break it down a little bit, when it comes to clinical effectiveness, I think that's actually pretty straightforward in terms of informed patients and patient organizations don't want to be taking things that don't work. And so that becomes about communication so that there is a clear understanding. When you look at patient preferences, it absolutely, or public citizen preferences is the, you know, the term George used. When you look at that, it absolutely becomes more complex because, of course, no two people are the same. And so that's when the diversity comes in, and that's when you need a variety of voices in the room. I do think patient organizations, where they exist for particular conditions, and there are many of them in cancer, are really, really important in bringing a broad perspective. Not that they should ever replace the individual perspective, but I think they add to it as well. When it gets really, really tricky is, of course, the economics. And, you know, if you're looking at a potentially life-saving drug for a child, people are simply not going to take no for an answer for understandable reasons. And I think maybe that's more of a societal conversation we have, because I always think if a child was kidnapped, we would expect that every resource would be put into saving them. So how do we think about it as a society? And I think all of it ultimately comes back to communication.
Fantastic, and maybe that's a good note in which to pause. I think we're at time, so I just want to take the opportunity sincerely to thank the three of you for your presentations. I think they were really thought-provoking and interesting, and built actually on what we heard in the first webinar. And to everyone who joined today, just say sincere thanks, and we'll be in touch well in advance of the next webinar in the series. So have a nice day, and thanks again to everybody. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Ronan.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.